last straw. And, you, Laila, you're bastard, get the f*** out of my country. And my name is Martin Schnitzler. Come find me, please. Please report me, because I will love it. You're going to die, Mafsed Sunad, or whatever the f*** your name is.
Well, that's a caller who identified himself as Martin Schnitzler, leaving a voicemail at the Islamic Center of St. Petersburg early Saturday morning. According to the Florida chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, the U.S. Department of Justice and local law enforcement are investigating the phoned terror threats to mosques in the state, and that CAIR-Florida is calling for hate crime charges. Joining me in the studio now is the Government and Legal Affairs Director of CAIR-Florida, Laila Abdelaziz. Welcome back to WMNF Midpoint, Laila.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.
And tell us what we've learned so far, first of all, about this man who left those threats. Who gives his name? He gives on the recording as Martin Schnitzler. Do we know anything about him?
I can't really speak about the details of the individual that left the voicemail because there is an ongoing investigation. But I will say that I think that because of the stigmatizing rhetoric of many leaders throughout the country, people just feel that this kind of behavior and this attitude is okay, and they think that it's accepted. And that's why, my conclusion is that he feels so comfortable associating his name with this very painful message that he left.
When I heard it, there were two things that struck me. One is how violent this person was his speech was, and two is how bold and correct. How could you be so? If you were going to threaten someone, why would you leave your name? Why would you not disguise your voice? It just seems like he didn't feel that there would be any retribution whatsoever.
And maybe because that's what we've been seeing for the past several years. When we see legislation that's passed by state legislatures and when we see people running for president that are saying that there is something inherently evil in Islam, that there is something wrong with Muslims, that Muslims are not welcome in the country, it only further empowers individuals such as this person who's, I think fundamentally they're afraid. They feel fear towards something that they do not know or do not understand or just have not, engaged with in their life path. And there's many more, broad issues concerning everyday Americans, and when you have those frustrations and when you can easily scapegoat and target your fear towards a group that looks different than you or acts different than you, and then, add to that, parallel to that, the rhetoric we see coming from news media, from presidential candidates, from elected officials in our own state, and this is the reality of what happens.
This wasn't the only mosque that was threatened. What else do we know about mosques that were threatened in Florida and then elsewhere?
Well, at CAIR-Florida, we deal with mosques receiving threats monthly. This isn't new for us. I think that because of the Paris attacks and because this conversation is again being elevated to the national, international level, people are paying attention and watching. But oftentimes we don't put out public information about the threats that mosques receive. There is a federal government program that gives security grants to mosques. So for the past year, we've been trying to engage mosque leadership across the state with securing those security grants so that they can have proactive measures in place for security threats that they receive. So we've been trying to do our due diligence to educate our community and engage law enforcement, state, national law enforcement agencies with the community so that people know what resources are available to them. We had this very concerning message left on Saturday. On Sunday, a Muslim family in Orlando was shot at 3 times in their home, in their neighborhood. So we are also opening an investigation on that incident. We believe that the response of our federal government and state government needs to be clear, and it needs to not be divisive, and it needs to not stigmatize any segment of the population and allow for people to heal and come together in these moments. But at the same time, you need accountability and you need, the full extent of the law.
Outside of Florida, there have been some reports of the same type of behavior, I guess. A mosque in Peterborough, Ontario was set ablaze. The Detroit Free Press is saying an individual who posted a Twitter message urging violence against the city of Dearborn, Michigan, because of its Muslim population has been located, and police said no longer is a threat to Dearborn. The graphic tweet was posted Saturday and ignited controversy on social media, and this is what the tweet said: Dearborn, Michigan has the highest Muslim population in the United States. Let's F that place up and send a message to ISIS. We're coming. Later on he wrote, I want to re-enlist now, #prayers for Paris. I think that people get the idea that this would strike fear into a community. What are you hearing?
I'd like to, first say that the majority of the victims of, I call it Daesh. I don't personally use the term ISIS to refer to Islamic State in Syria, but the largest population impacted and victim to their activities are Muslims. And Syrian refugees, or the Muslim refugee crisis that Europe is facing and that the entire world is facing right now, these refugees are fleeing the same threat that is responsible for the attacks in Paris. I think it's very concerning to create this parallelism that, ISIS equals Muslim equals terrorist equals Islam. That's the ideology that we need to attack and deconstruct. But because we don't have leadership and because it's so easy to be afraid in moments like this, you see these parallelisms, become a reality in people's lives, and it leads to these kinds of targets and threats to our collective safety here in this country.
So having EU countries close their borders, what that will do is that will essentially mean that the victims of these terror attacks are going to receive less help now. They'll be stuck. They'll be stranded.
Well, the mass wave of this, unprecedented refugee crisis in the world is due to the fact of all countries in the world's inability to find a political solution to the chaos that is the Middle East today. And we can talk about that in and of itself for hours, but absolutely, that's not a solution. These people are fleeing for their lives. Literally, these refugees have lost all hope. I'm a refugee. I came to the United States as a refugee, and I don't need to explain the impact that immigrant communities have had to Western nations, and where would we be without our embracing people from all over the world. But at the same time, we have threats at a level that we've never faced before. So we need to be able to honestly understand these problems and be very honest with ourselves in presenting solutions to them.
Most of the gunmen in France in the Paris attacks were born and raised in France or Belgium. They did find that one passport that was a Syrian passport, and they're not certain of the origin of that person right now. But so it's, I guess they would call it homegrown terror. Yeah,
and also, groups like Daesh use the vitriol and the reaction that comes to these situations to recruit these young men to do the activities that they do. In France, you have just as we have our own domestic issues with minority communities in the United States, but France has these domestic problems that really target and stigmatize and isolate the Muslim immigrant community in France. And I think that stigmatization of Islam as an ideology, as a religion, as a group collective of people kind of, helps perpetrate this feeling of othership, of this is not my country, I'm not welcome here, and I'm not justifying it in any way, but the reality is that these emotions are what motivate and allow Daesh to recruit these young men to do the things that they're doing.
And what do you think about the idea that when you have Americans who are so frustrated as the caller who left the voicemail at the Islamic Center of St. Petersburg, I would guess that type of thing could also be recruiting for Daesh.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We talk about that all the time with federal agencies and state agents. You have to respond to this very firmly, and you have to, send a very clear message to the public that this very dangerous rhetoric and these threats. I mean, it's not just a frustrated caller, right? This person made a very serious threat against an entire community that is right across the bay from us. Including children. I mean, he said, you know, he would not hold back from a 2-year-old or a woman or whatever it is. So, you know, it's concerning. We hope that charges will be filed, and we hope that, you know, we can address it honestly so that we can move on properly.
It's not the border problem or question is not even just being addressed in Europe. It's also in this country. We're having talks of closing borders. Republican presidential hopeful Marco Rubio says the U.S. cannot properly screen and should not let in refugees fleeing that war-ravaged country. Syria is what he's referring to. Rubio said yesterday on ABC's This Week that it's impossible to find out if Syrian refugees have links to terrorists and they should be kept out. In September, Rubio was quoted as saying he could support letting in some refugees that are properly vetted. Rival candidate Jeb Bush says on NBC's Meet the Press that the U.S. should admit some Syrians, particularly Christians, and the governor of Alabama has declared he will not allow relocations. I mean,
So the governor of Alabama said that he will refuse Syrian refugees. That is not allowed. It is not allowed for a state official to discriminate against national origin. And it's really, you know, it's outstanding to me how little these individuals know about the policy and the procedures that their own government has in place. We work very closely with the federal government's refugee resettlement task force here in Tampa Bay. And the reality is that Latin American refugees that come into the state are probably takes between 6 to 12 months to vet them properly, but overwhelmingly right now the United States is letting Syrian refugees into the country, only Syrian refugees that have dire medical conditions, and their screening process takes about 16 to 24 months. So I think that, you know, as it currently stands, what I've seen, how I've seen the process work, our federal government is very properly vetting refugees that are coming into the country, but there's clearly Syrian refugees are going through a much more complicated vetting process because it's taking double the time, and the majority of refugees that are coming into the country right now are coming from Muslim majority countries, not just from Syria, from Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and this should be a concern to all of us. The United States has bombed 18 Muslim majority countries since 1975. There is a reason that there's this chaos and this lack of opportunity and lack of social infrastructure in that region of the world that is forcing those people out of their homes. No one wants to leave their home. That is the end-all, be-all of hope for your own existence as a human being. And now the Western world is confronted with this huge crisis. But, you know, we also have to acknowledge what we have done to create this crisis.
A lot of the European countries are facing this in a maybe more substantial and real way than the U.S. has yet. And there's a
because it's closer geographically.
Exactly, and there's a big debate in Europe about, well, you know, countries like England are saying we should have fewer refugees, but then there's some countries that are saying, you know, we're going to welcome as many refugees as we can. And if you look at the numbers and you compare those numbers to how many Syrian refugees specifically the U.S. has taken in, the U.S. virtually has taken in none compared to the tens of thousands of refugees that are being taken in by some of these other Western European countries. That's probably going to have to change. I imagine that we'll be seeing a lot more Syrian refugees into the United States in the coming years.
The Obama administration has signaled that they'd like to expand the number of the quota of allowed Syrian refugees that enter the country. Again, it is very minimal numbers of Syrian refugees that we have admitted because we are only admitting those with dire medical conditions right now. But, and this is really important for us, you know, it's very important for us to talk about this because the country is going to be choosing the next chief, you know, the next president very soon, and that administration will be forced to deal and address with this problem. So, you know, there's this, in these moments, and we can draw parallels to how law enforcement has, you know, the problems happening with law enforcement here domestically, but you can either ramp up security and become isolationist and say that there's this fundamental problem with this religion or this ideology or this group, or you can be honest and recognize that good policies can create healthy communities, and there is a way, there's a proven, tested way to ensure that refugees are resettled in a healthy, productive way to the refugee communities and to home communities. It's unclear what that quota is going to be for the next year, but we are hearing from refugee resettlement task force agencies that it'll be increasing.
Let's go to the phones. We've had some people holding for a long time, and let me see who's been the longest. How about Moldani in Tampa?
It's really horrific what it happened to the Russian airplane, to the hundreds of people that
Absolutely. So it's very difficult. I think for the Western world, for European countries, and for the United States, because there is land and oceans that separate individuals from the pain. There was a huge terrorist attack in Beirut last week. There's drone strikes that kill concerning levels of civilians in Yemen. There's no limit to the civilian loss in the Middle East right now.
Hospitals being bombed.
Being bombed in Afghanistan. Even though those hospitals and their coordinates have been submitted to American military officials and their allies, and people are disconnected from that pain in Europe and in America. I think that's the reality. They don't understand what an impact those civilian casualties and that destruction. I mean, we're talking about Syria specifically, and all of my Syrian American friends can never return to the Syria that they grew up in. Syria is utterly destroyed. And when these terrorist attacks happen in Paris, when they happen on European soil or American soil, people feel the pain, and it triggers, very immediate fear in those individuals, but this is happening daily throughout the Middle East.
Thank you for that call, Moldani. I appreciate it. We're going to move on. Go to Terry in Tampa. Hi, Terry. Terry, are you there? Okay, Sister Kelly, is that what you said? Yes, go ahead, please.
Has a long list of hate groups, and the caller that wants to build a wall. Well, hello, sir. There has been a wall, and the other.
It is true that the number of undocumented groups coming into the country is at the lowest that it's been in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
that
you.
call, Sister Kelly. 813-239-9663. If you'd like to join this conversation, my guest is Laila Abdelaziz. She's the Legislative and Government Affairs Director of CAIR-Florida, and CAIR stands for the Council on American Islamic Relations. And my name is Seán. I'm the host of Midpoint Monday. It's 12:48 in the afternoon, and we'd like to hear what you have to say about this topic. We have Jonathan in Winter Haven. Hi, Jonathan. But it's not a bad thing, though, to get information and to readjust your thinking. Do you want to respond about the mockery at all? Oh wait, you're... Right, thanks so much for that call. 813-239-9663. Let's take one more call before we ask some more questions. But let's say, my phone, sorry, my computer's having some trouble. Let's go to Zebulon in Tampa. Hi, Zebulon.
From Timothy McVeigh, and I don't recall Muslims.
I have someone writing about video games. Do you want to?
Threatening to blow them up or shoot their.
I guess they're talking about like violence in video games. Is that anything you want to? Because we don't have to.
I mean, I'll address it if I feel like maybe something more on subject, but I'll address it because I talk about that all the time.
Maybe you can respond to the caller, Zebulon, about he's talking about Timothy McVeigh.
Yeah. Everybody killing him, even though he didn't do anything wrong. The military and violent solutions, so-called solutions, are not solutions at all. You can't stop war with war. That's like trying to dry off by jumping into a lake. We need to kind of get to the root causes of a lot of this stuff. And a lot of this stuff is what we call blowback from things that were done to these countries, mostly by the CIA and the KGB and MI6 and the Mossad over the last 100 years or so. That's all I wanted to say.
All right, thanks for that call. So Zebulon's talking about what Malcolm X called the chickens coming home to roost. That's one thing. He also, what do you think about the idea that contrary to what Senator McCain wants, you aren't going to get peace by bombing people?
Well, I think a lot of honest experts in this field have already come to the conclusion a very long time ago that the so-called war on terror cannot be fought through combat troops. That as our caller just said, you do not fight war with war. But it's also kind of this this ideological war, right? Like this forced ideological war. We called a war on drugs, and now 40 years later, we're seeing the impact of the war on drugs, the so-called war on drugs. And the same with the war on terror. And I think that, this reminds me of a Voltaire quote about killing to the sounds of trumpets versus, killing as an individual. We have to be honest about the perception of the presence of our military and our military operations in the Middle East. And like I said earlier on the show, we've bombed 18 Muslim-majority countries since the 1970s. That has left an impact. That has left a very serious impact. And even before that, I think an irony here, and Karen Armstrong speaks about this, France colonized Syria. And Karen Armstrong talks about how the former colonizers are now dealing with the ripple effects of, lack of civil infrastructure, lack of civil institutions that are organic and led by the people of those countries that are now nation border states. And this, we can understand the history. We have to understand the history. We have to be honest about the history. And I agree that war cannot be fought with war, but there's also a very serious lack of political solutions, which is creating this frustration, which is creating these vacuums, which is allowing groups like Daesh to recruit and develop and gain allies.
And we keep hearing about how political solutions is the only way to go, or we hear that from some circles, and then you look at what's happening on the ground, where there's U.S. boots on the ground now, and there are Russians in Syria. I mean, it seems like every day it's becoming more and more complicated to
It's been complicated for years.
I just mean it's the parties that are involving themselves deeper and deeper and more militarily, and
we're moving even more towards aggression versus diplomatic, peaceful solutions. Yes, absolutely, and this is concerning. And but have we seen our military be challenged at all for the operations that it's doing on the ground daily in the Middle East? I don't think that conversation is happening in the United States.
You mean challenging, saying, should we be doing this? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I mean, the president just got the largest military bill, the military authorization bill that a U.S. president will ever have to sign last week.
He got it from Congress, and he also signed it despite the fact that it had a position in there that was completely opposite of what he's saying he wants, which is closing Guantanamo, making it more difficult to close Guantanamo, so he still signed it even though it was a very large appropriation for the military. Every time there's a major terrorist attack, I get two different waves of information that are so contradictory that I want you to sort this out for me. One thing I get is I get a lot of Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals condemning the attacks. And then at the same time, I get bombarded with all this information saying how Muslims don't condemn terrorism. Sometimes as plainly as that. Why don't Muslims condemn this particular terrorist act or terrorism in general? You're with an organization that helps Muslims. Where
well, it's gotten to the point that we've, in our theology, it is said that if you save one human, it is as if you saved all of mankind, right? And I think that anyone that believes in God and oneness and all good things in life would agree that violence and aggression is a horrible, painful thing. I think that all religions share those sentiments. But, the Muslim community has gotten to the point now where it's like, here is a list of all of our organizations and community leaders that weekly, daily condemn aggression, terrorism, violence, war. We can be honest and condemn U.S. military operations that kill innocent civilians in the Middle East, and we can be honest in condemning, isolated Daesh-led terrorism. Like I said, the largest community that's a victim to Daesh activities is the Muslim community in the Middle East right now. And, people and